One of the biggest misunderstandings people have about avoidance is this idea that they are emotionally cold from the very beginning. That's not true. In fact, many avoidants are some of the most emotionally intense people you will ever meet in the early stages of attraction. And that's exactly why the experience becomes so confusing for the people who fall for them. See, avoidants often create connection through intensity rather than consistency. There's a difference. Consistency builds trust slowly. Intensity creates emotional acceleration, and most people mistake acceleration for intimacy. When an avoidant is drawn to you, they can become deeply present in the moment. The chemistry feels electric. The conversations feel unusually personal. The physical connection feels amplified. You start believing, this person sees me differently. And in many ways they do. But what you're experiencing is not always emotional security. Sometimes you're experiencing emotional projection mixed with desire, novelty, and fantasy. Psychologically, this happens because avoidants often feel safest in relationships before real emotional dependency begins. Early attraction is exciting because it still contains distance. There's room for mystery, room for escape, room for emotional control. They can give affection freely when vulnerability still feels optional. But once the relationship starts requiring emotional accountability, deeper communication, or sustained closeness, something shifts internally. This is where many people become trapped in confusion, because the avoidant who once seemed emotionally fearless suddenly becomes emotionally difficult to reach. The warmth cools down, the certainty disappears, and the partner starts asking themselves painful questions. Was any of it real? Did I imagine the connection? How can someone feel so close one moment and so distant the next? But the truth is, the intensity was real. The problem is that intensity and intimacy are not the same thing. A person can crave closeness while simultaneously fearing what closeness requires. That's the contradiction at the center of avoidant behavior. They often want love emotionally, physically, psychologically, but they fear the loss of control that deep attachment creates. So they unconsciously build relationships around emotional stimulation instead of emotional safety. And this is why these dynamics become so addictive. Human beings are wired to chase emotional inconsistency. When someone gives you powerful moments of connection followed by withdrawal, your nervous system starts searching for answers. You replay conversations. You analyze behavior. You try to recover the emotional high you felt in the beginning. And without realizing it, you stop building a healthy relationship and start pursuing emotional reassurance. That's why so many people leave avoidant relationships emotionally exhausted. Not because there was no connection, but because the connection rarely becomes stable enough to feel safe. Real intimacy is not built on emotional fireworks alone. It is built on presence, openness, consistency, and the ability to stay emotionally available after the excitement fades. Anyone can create intensity for a moment. Very few people can sustain emotional honesty over time. And that is the difference between being desired and being truly loved. One of the most emotionally disorienting experiences a person can go through is being deeply chosen by someone, and then suddenly emotionally abandoned by that same person. And this is one of the patterns people often experience with avoidance. In the beginning, the connection can feel incredibly personal. They make you feel seen. They listen closely. They mirror your energy. Sometimes they even reveal vulnerable parts of themselves that make you believe a rare emotional bond is forming. And for a while, it genuinely feels real. That's important to understand. Most avoidants are not consciously manipulating people in the beginning. They are responding honestly to the emotional experience they are having in that moment. The problem is that many avoidants experience connection intensely in short bursts, but struggle to sustain emotional openness once attachment deepens and expectations become real. So what happens? At first, they move toward you. Emotionally, physically, psychologically. They text constantly. They create closeness. They make future plans. They give attention in ways that feel meaningful and intentional. And because human beings naturally bond through emotional responsiveness, you begin attaching to the consistency of that connection. But then something subtle starts changing. The relationship becomes emotionally real. Your presence begins to matter more deeply to them. Vulnerability increases. Expectations increase. The emotional stakes become higher. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, that growing intimacy can unconsciously trigger fear rather than comfort. This is the part most people misunderstand. Avoidants are not always running away from the person. Often, they are running away from the emotional exposure the relationship is creating inside themselves. Deep connection activates vulnerability. Vulnerability activates fear, and fear activates distance. So the same person who once pursued closeness begins withdrawing from it. Suddenly, communication becomes inconsistent. Their energy changes. Affection feels restrained. Conversations lose depth. You notice emotional hesitation where certainty used to exist. And because there was once so much warmth, the withdrawal feels even more painful. The contrast becomes psychologically brutal. This creates emotional confusion because the human mind always searches for continuity. We want behavior to make sense. So when someone who once made us feel deeply valued becomes emotionally unavailable, we internalize it. We assume we did something wrong. We overanalyze every interaction trying to recover emotional stability. But often, the shift has less to do with your worth and more to do with the avoidance relationship to emotional dependency itself. Philosophically, this reveals something important about human attachment. People do not only fear rejection. Many people fear surrender. They fear the loss of control that comes with being emotionally affected by another human being. And avoidants, more than most, often equate dependence with danger. So they create distance to regain psychological control over themselves. The tragedy is that this distance often wounds the very connection they secretly wanted to preserve. Because relationships cannot survive on attraction alone. Emotional safety requires continuity. It requires the ability to remain emotionally present even after the excitement becomes responsibility. And the hardest lesson for many people is realizing this. Someone can deeply feel your value and still lack the emotional capacity to stay close to it. One of the most confusing dynamics people experience with avoidance is this strange contradiction where physical intimacy can feel incredibly deep, while emotional intimacy still feels painfully limited. And if you don't understand the psychology behind that difference, you can spend years misunderstanding the relationship you're actually in. Because for many avoidants, physical closeness feels safer than emotional exposure. Now think about that carefully. Physical intimacy has structure. It has immediacy. It allows connection without necessarily requiring complete emotional transparency. In many cases, it becomes a controlled form of closeness. There's affection, passion, chemistry, touch, all the things that create the feeling of intimacy, but without the same level of emotional surrender required in vulnerable communication. And that distinction matters. Real emotional intimacy requires a person to reveal uncertainty, fear, insecurity, dependency, longing, sadness, and emotional need. It requires them to let another person see parts of themselves they cannot fully control. And for avoidance, that level of openness can feel psychologically threatening. So what happens instead? They often learn to express connection physically because it allows them to feel close while still maintaining a certain emotional distance internally. The body moves toward intimacy while the deeper emotional walls remain standing. This is why so many partners become confused in avoidant relationships. They think, how can someone hold me so closely, desire me so intensely, spend so much time with me physically, yet still struggle to communicate emotionally? The contradiction feels impossible until you understand that physical vulnerability and emotional vulnerability are not the same experience psychologically. In fact, many avoidants feel more emotionally exposed during honest conversations than during physical intimacy itself. A deep emotional conversation removes performance. It removes distraction. It forces presence. And presence is difficult for someone whose nervous system has learned to associate emotional dependency with risk. So they may avoid conversations about commitment, emotional needs, future expectations, or relational insecurity, not because they feel nothing, but because those conversations activate emotional pressure they don't know how to regulate. And over time, this creates imbalance in the relationship. One partner begins seeking emotional clarity while the avoidant begins seeking emotional space. One person wants deeper reassurance while the other starts feeling overwhelmed by the weight of emotional expectation. And eventually, the relationship starts existing in fragments. Close physically, disconnected emotionally. This is why chemistry alone is never enough to sustain a healthy relationship. A powerful physical connection can temporarily hide emotional incompatibility. Desire can create the illusion of security. Passion can distract people from emotional inconsistency. But eventually, every relationship reaches a point where emotional presence matters more than emotional excitement. Because love is not measured by how intensely someone desires you in private moments. Love is measured by emotional availability when life becomes uncomfortable, uncertain, or difficult. And this is where many people finally realize something painful. Being wanted is not the same thing as being emotionally held. Someone can crave your body while still fearing true emotional closeness with your soul. And until a person learns to feel safe being emotionally vulnerable, even the strongest chemistry in the world will struggle to create lasting intimacy. What makes avoidant dynamics so psychologically powerful is not just the attraction itself, it's the unpredictability of the attraction. Human beings are emotionally wired to seek stability, but paradoxically, we become obsessed with inconsistency. And this is where the avoidant push-pull cycle becomes emotionally dangerous for many people. Because the cycle creates intermittent reinforcement. And psychologically, intermittent reinforcement is one of the strongest conditioning mechanisms that exists. It's the same principle behind addiction. When affection, attention, reassurance, and closeness are given inconsistently, the brain becomes hyper-focused on regaining the emotional reward. The uncertainty itself increases emotional fixation. That's why people often become more emotionally attached to avoidance after the withdrawal begins, not before. At first, the connection feels extraordinary. There's chemistry, emotional intensity, deep conversations, physical closeness. You feel chosen, important, seen, then suddenly distance appears. Messages slow down. Energy changes, emotional availability weakens, and instead of pulling away, many people instinctively move closer. Why? Because the human nervous system interprets emotional inconsistency as a problem to solve. You begin searching for the version of the person you experienced in the beginning. You replay memories. You analyze conversations. You blame yourself for shifts you don't fully understand. And slowly, without realizing it, the relationship stops being about mutual connection and starts becoming about emotional recovery. You're no longer experiencing peace. You're chasing reassurance. This is why avoidant dynamics can become emotionally consuming. The moments of closeness feel so emotionally rewarding that the mind tolerates increasing levels of distance just to experience those moments again. And every small return of affection feels amplified because it temporarily relieves the anxiety created by the withdrawal. But here's the deeper truth most people fail to recognize. Anxiety is not intimacy. Emotional obsession is not love. A relationship that constantly destabilizes your emotional state may feel intense, but intensity alone is not evidence of emotional depth. In many cases, it's evidence that your nervous system has become trapped inside unpredictability. Philosophically, this speaks to something profound about human attachment. People often confuse emotional activation with emotional meaning. We assume that because someone occupies our mind constantly, the connection must be extraordinary. But sometimes the mind clings hardest to what feels unresolved, uncertain, or incomplete. Avoidants unintentionally create this sense of incompletion. They move close enough to create attachment, then distant enough to trigger fear of loss. And the partner becomes trapped between hope and confusion. This is why emotionally secure people often leave these dynamics earlier. Not because they feel less, but because they recognize that healthy love should not require constant emotional survival mode. Secure attachment brings clarity. Avoidant cycles often bring emotional instability disguised as passion. And eventually, a person has to ask themselves a difficult question. Am I connected to who this person truly is? Or am I addicted to the emotional highs and lows they create inside me? Because real love does not keep you emotionally starving between moments of connection. Real love allows your nervous system to rest. And the moment peace starts feeling unfamiliar, you may no longer be chasing love. You may be chasing emotional unpredictability itself. At the core of avoidant behavior, there is usually a conflict that most people never fully see. On the surface, it can look like they are simply afraid of commitment, afraid of closeness, or incapable of love. But psychologically, the deeper issue is often this: they fear losing themselves inside attachment. For many avoidants, independence is not just a preference, it becomes psychological protection. Somewhere in their emotional development, vulnerability became associated with danger. Dependence may have once felt disappointing, overwhelming, controlling, or emotionally unsafe. So over time, they learned to equate self-protection with emotional distance. They built an identity around autonomy, self-reliance, and control over their emotional world. Now here's where it becomes complicated. Avoidants still desire connection. They still want intimacy, affection, understanding, and love like everyone else. Human beings are biologically wired for attachment. No amount of emotional defense completely erases that need. So avoidants often move toward relationships with genuine excitement and sincere emotional interest. But the closer the relationship becomes, the more another fear begins to activate internally. The fear of losing freedom. And this fear is often misunderstood because freedom to an avoidant does not simply mean space or independence in the ordinary sense. Psychologically, freedom represents emotional safety. It represents control over their internal state. The moment they begin feeling emotionally dependent on someone, their nervous system may interpret that dependency as vulnerability, and vulnerability feels dangerous. So the very relationship they wanted starts triggering internal resistance. This is why avoidants often seem most comfortable in the early stages of connection when emotional intensity exists without full responsibility. But once the relationship becomes stable, committed, or emotionally serious, they may begin unconsciously creating distance. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal. Sometimes it looks like emotional numbness. Sometimes it looks like criticism, irritation, confusion, or suddenly needing space. And many partners take this personally because the shift feels so abrupt. One moment, the avoidant appears deeply invested, and the next moment they seem emotionally trapped by the closeness they once pursued. But internally, what's often happening is not the disappearance of feelings, it's the activation of fear. Fear of expectation, fear of emotional dependency, fear of losing control over themselves. This creates one of the most painful contradictions in avoidant relationships. They may genuinely love someone while simultaneously resisting the emotional weight of being deeply connected to them. And this is why many avoidants sabotage relationships they secretly value. Not always consciously, not always maliciously, but psychologically, distance becomes their method of emotional regulation. When intimacy creates anxiety, creating space feels like relief. The problem is that the relief is temporary, while the damage to the relationship becomes permanent over time. Philosophically, this reveals something profound about human nature. People do not only run from pain, sometimes they run from love itself when love threatens the identity they built to survive. Because real intimacy changes people. It requires compromise, emotional exposure, accountability, and interdependence. It asks a person to let someone else matter deeply enough that loss becomes possible. And for avoidance, that level of emotional surrender can feel terrifying because it removes the illusion of complete self-protection. But here is the tragedy. The more someone prioritizes emotional self-protection above all else, the harder it becomes to sustain the very connection they long for. Love requires openness. Attachment requires risk. You cannot experience deep intimacy while remaining emotionally untouchable. And eventually, avoidants often discover a painful truth too late. Protecting yourself from vulnerability may save you from temporary discomfort, but it can also cost you the deepest connections of your life. Because freedom without emotional connection eventually becomes isolation. And a person who is always escaping emotional vulnerability may one day realize they also escaped the love they were searching for all along. After experiencing the emotional intensity, the confusion, the distance, the push-pull cycle, many people eventually arrive at the same question. How do I stop this dynamic from controlling me emotionally? And the answer is not found in learning how to chase avoidance more effectively. It's not found in becoming more desirable, more patient, more understanding, or more emotionally available than you already are. The answer begins with emotional self-control. Because the moment your emotional stability becomes dependent on another person's inconsistency, you lose your center. And this is where many people unknowingly abandon themselves in avoidant relationships. They become so focused on restoring connection that they stop paying attention to what the relationship is doing to their nervous system, their self-worth, and their emotional health. They start over-explaining, over-analyzing, over-giving, over-waiting. And psychologically, this happens because uncertainty activates emotional survival instincts. Human beings seek resolution. We want clarity. We want emotional reassurance. So when someone gives mixed signals, closeness one moment, distance the next, the mind naturally tries to close the gap. It wants to solve the emotional puzzle. But here's the problem. You cannot build emotional security by chasing emotional unpredictability. And this is the lesson many people must learn the hard way. Real strength is not the ability to hold on to someone who keeps pulling away. Real strength is the ability to remain emotionally grounded while seeing reality clearly. It's the ability to stop romanticizing emotional inconsistency simply because the connection once felt powerful, because intensity can hypnotize people. The highs feel extraordinary, so they tolerate the lows longer than they should. They confuse emotional craving with emotional compatibility, and eventually they start betraying their own boundaries in the hope that enough love, patience, or sacrifice will finally make the avoidant feel safe enough to stay fully present. But emotional safety cannot be forced. You cannot love someone out of their attachment wounds if they are unwilling to confront them themselves. And this is where emotional maturity becomes essential. Mature love is not about rescuing people from themselves. It's about recognizing what is emotionally sustainable and what is emotionally destructive. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop trying to convince someone to choose closeness. Because the deeper issue is not whether an avoidant feels something for you. Many of them do. The deeper issue is whether they possess the emotional capacity, self-awareness, and willingness to maintain intimacy consistently once vulnerability becomes real. And those are very different things. This is why boundaries matter so much. Boundaries are not punishments. They are acts of self-respect. They protect your emotional stability from becoming consumed by another person's unresolved patterns. Without boundaries, people slowly lose themselves trying to maintain relationships that continuously destabilize them emotionally. Now, philosophically, there's something even deeper happening here. Many people become attached not only to the avoidant, but to the hope of finally being enough to change the avoidant. They unconsciously turn the relationship into a test of worthiness. If this emotionally unavailable person fully chooses me, then I must truly be valuable. But your value cannot depend on another person's emotional limitations. Someone's inability to sustain closeness is not proof that you are hard to love. And once a person truly understands that, the entire dynamic begins to lose power. Because healing starts when you stop chasing validation through emotional suffering. It starts when peace becomes more attractive than emotional chaos. It starts when you realize that healthy love should expand your emotional stability, not constantly threaten it. And this does not mean becoming cold, detached, or cynical. It means becoming emotionally disciplined. It means learning the difference between compassion and self-abandonment. You can understand someone's wounds without sacrificing your own well-being to carry them. In many ways, avoidant relationships force people into an important psychological awakening. They expose where someone confuses longing with love, pursuit with value, or emotional intensity with emotional safety. And if a person grows through that experience consciously, they come out stronger, wiser, and more emotionally grounded than before. Because eventually, emotionally healthy people stop asking, how do I make this person stay? And they start asking a far more powerful question. Does this connection allow me to remain fully connected to myself? That question changes everything. Because the strongest position you can ever stand in emotionally is not the ability to control another person's feelings. It is the ability to protect your peace without losing your capacity to love. And once you master that, emotionally unavailable people no longer control your self-worth, because you finally understand that love without emotional consistency will never be enough to sustain a healthy soul. So when you step back and look at the entire pattern, you begin to realize why avoidant dynamics affect people so deeply. It's not simply about attraction. It's about contradiction. Avoidance can create extraordinary emotional intensity while simultaneously fearing the vulnerability required to sustain true intimacy. They can make someone feel deeply desired, deeply chosen, and emotionally awakened, only to retreat the moment the connection starts becoming emotionally real. And for many people, that experience becomes psychologically consuming because they mistake emotional unpredictability for emotional depth. But understanding this changes everything. The goal is not to hate avoidance. It's not to label them as villains or emotionally incapable human beings. Many avoidants are carrying unresolved fears they don't fully understand themselves. They often want love deeply while fearing the emotional exposure love demands from them. And that inner conflict creates the very push-pull dynamics that leave so many relationships emotionally unstable. The real lesson is about awareness. Awareness of how attachment patterns shape behavior. Awareness of how emotional inconsistency affects the nervous system. Awareness of the difference between chemistry and emotional safety. Because real love is not built only on passion, attraction, mystery, or emotional highs. Real love requires emotional presence. It requires consistency. It requires the willingness to remain open even after the excitement fades and vulnerability becomes unavoidable. And perhaps most importantly, this journey teaches something powerful about yourself. You cannot heal emotional chaos by abandoning your own peace. You cannot earn healthy love by overextending yourself emotionally for someone who refuses to meet you halfway. And you cannot build lasting intimacy with someone who only feels safe when distance exists. At some point, emotional maturity means accepting a difficult truth. Not every intense connection is meant to become a healthy relationship. Some connections arrive to awaken you. Some arrive to teach you boundaries. Some arrive to reveal the wounds you still need to heal inside yourself. And sometimes the greatest transformation happens the moment you stop chasing people who fear closeness and start building a life rooted in emotional clarity, self-respect, and inner stability. Because in the end, the most powerful relationship you will ever build is the one where you no longer lose yourself trying to be loved by someone else.